tiredness had become so deep that Lieutenant Margaret Fraser barely felt it anymore. It was like she was living underwater. She had been awake for 37 hours when the enemy started firing big explosions closer and closer that morning in mid-January 1944. The field hospital near Ortona, Italy, suddenly found itself caught in the middle of a German counterattack that no one had seen coming. Fraser was 26 years old, from a small town in Nova Scotia. Her father ran a general store, and her mother raised 5 children while also acting as the town's unofficial nurse for anyone who couldn't afford a doctor. Margaret had inherited her mother's steady hands and calm nature. She trained as a nurse in Halifax and joined the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps in 1942 because staying safe in Canada while other people's sons and brothers were dying in Europe felt wrong to her. She had been in Italy for 4 months, working at a field hospital that treated soldiers wounded in the brutal fighting as Canadian forces pushed north through some of the hardest terrain and fiercest resistance of the war. The hospital was set up inside a partly destroyed monastery about 3 miles behind the front lines. It was close enough that artillery could be heard clearly, and close enough that wounded men could be brought in quickly before they bled to death. The thick stone walls offered some protection from shelling, though nothing could stop a direct hit. There were 28 beds in the old main hall, another 15 in the chapel, and when the fighting was heavy, extra patients lay on stretchers in the hallways. Fraser was one of 6 nurses working shifts that were supposed to be 12 hours long, but in reality lasted until you physically collapsed and someone forced you to rest for a few hours. Since arriving in Italy, she had treated 743 patients. She knew the exact number because she kept a careful record. She wrote down every name she could get, every injury, every treatment, and how it ended. 743 men whose blood soaked through bandages she changed, whose wounds she cleaned, stitched, and packed with powder, whose hands she held when nothing else could be done. Some were Canadians, men from her own country who reminded her of boys she'd grown up with. Others were British, American, Polish, and soldiers from many other Allied nations. And 47 of them were German prisoners, enemy soldiers who were wounded and brought in by Canadian patrols or who stumbled into the hospital on their own, seeking help that international law required her to give no matter what uniform they wore. The shelling that morning began around 6 o'clock. It was heavier than usual, the sharp, familiar sound of German 88 guns the Canadian troops had learned to fear. Fraser was changing bandages on a Canadian corporal who had lost his left leg below the knee. She spoke softly to him, to keep him calm while she worked. Then, the first shells landed close enough to shake dust down from the ceiling. The other nurses looked up and met each other's eyes. Without saying a word, they understood what it meant. Then, they went back to work. The wounded still needed care, and stopping was never an option. The German attack moved fast. Infantry supported by tanks pushed through a gap in the Canadian lines, trying to take back ground lost during the hard house-to-house fighting around Ortona. The front line, which had been 3 miles away, suddenly was only 300 yards away, then 100. Soon, Canadian soldiers were retreating past the monastery in confusion, with German troops advancing behind them. The hospital had maybe 10 minutes of warning before the Germans reached the building. 10 minutes to decide whether to run or stay with the patients who couldn't be moved. There was never really a choice. Most of the wounded were too badly hurt to survive being moved over rough roads. Trying to evacuate them would kill them just as surely as enemy fire would. So the nurses stayed. The 2 doctors stayed. The few orderlies stayed. They kept working as gunfire drew closer and German voices began shouting outside. Fraser was placing a chest tube into a soldier whose lung had collapsed when German soldiers burst through the door, rifles raised, shouting orders in German she couldn't understand, but didn't need to. She finished the procedure, carefully taped the tube in place, checked that her patient was breathing easier, and only then did she raise her hands and slowly stand. She turned to face the German soldiers who now surrounded her and the rest of the medical staff. One of them, a young non-commissioned officer who looked barely old enough to shave, was aiming his rifle straight at her chest. His hands were shaking slightly, his eyes were wide, filled with the raw tension and fear that comes from being in the middle of combat. Fraser had looked at him calmly, not moving, not speaking, just standing there with her hands raised and blood all over her uniform and exhaustion, making her almost too tired to feel fear. The German soldiers had searched the building quickly, checking rooms, securing potential threats, operating with the efficiency of experienced infantry who knew what they were doing. When they'd confirmed that the building held only wounded men and medical staff, the tension had decreased slightly, though weapons remained ready and everyone remained nervous. A German officer had appeared, an Oberleutnant in his early 30s with a tired face and mud-stained uniform, and he'd spoken to Fraser in accented but understandable English. "You are medical staff?" he'd asked. Fraser had nodded. "Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps," she'd said. "We're treating wounded." The officer had looked around the room, taking in the beds full of injured men, the makeshift operating area where one of the doctors was still working. On a patient, despite German guns trained on him, the organized chaos of a functioning field hospital. Under the Geneva Conventions, the officer had said, "You are non-combatants and entitled to protection, but you are also technically prisoners until we determine your status and decide what to do with this facility." Fraser had understood that the officer was in a difficult position. Military necessity might require him to evacuate the building or use it for his own wounded, but medical ethics and international law required him to ensure continued care for the patients already there. He'd made a decision quickly. "You will continue treating the wounded," he'd said. "My men will secure the building. You will not attempt to leave or to assist any Allied soldiers in escaping. Do you understand?" Fraser had understood and had agreed because she had no choice and because her patients needed continued care more than she needed freedom. The German officer had then asked to see the hospital records, wanting to understand what kind of facility they'd captured and how many patients were present. Fraser had shown him the log she'd been keeping, the detailed record of every patient treated over the past 4 months. The officer had started reading through it with professional interest, checking names against injuries, nodding at treatments that made sense, occasionally asking questions about specific cases. Then he'd stopped at a section and looked up at Fraser with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been respect. "You have treated over 700 patients?" he'd asked. "In 4 months?" Fraser had nodded, too tired to feel pride or defensiveness. "We've been busy," she'd said simply. "The fighting around here has been heavy." The officer had continued reading, his finger tracing down columns of names and dates and injuries. He'd paused again when he reached the section documenting treatment of German prisoners. "You treated our wounded," he'd said, and it wasn't quite a question. Fraser had met his eyes steadily. "The Geneva Conventions require it," she'd said. "Any wounded soldier brought here receives treatment regardless of which army he serves. We don't pick and choose based on uniforms." The officer had looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Some of our men died in your hospitals," he'd said, reading names from the log, "but many lived who would have died without treatment. You saved German lives." Fraser hadn't known how to respond to that. She'd been saving lives because that was her job, because she was a nurse and nurses treated the wounded. The nationality of the patient had never been the relevant factor. The relevant factors were severity of injury, available resources, and her skill at applying one to the other. But she understood that for this German officer reading through her records, the fact that a Canadian nurse had spent months saving German soldiers was significant in ways that went beyond medical professionalism. It complicated the simple narrative of enemies fighting to kill each other. It injected humanity into situations designed to strip humanity away. The officer had made another decision. "You and your staff will continue operating this hospital," he'd said. "I am placing guards to prevent escape, but you will have access to supplies and you will treat any wounded brought here. This includes German wounded. We have casualties from this morning's attack who need immediate care." Fraser had agreed, not because the officer had authority over her medical decisions, but because wounded men were wounded men and they needed help. The nationality wearing the uniform didn't change the color of the blood or the urgency of stopping it. Over the following 3 days, while the front lines stabilized and Canadian forces prepared a counterattack to retake the lost ground, Fraser and her fellow nurses worked under German supervision, treating both Allied and German wounded. The German guards were professional and correct, not friendly but not cruel, understanding that medical staff were protected non-combatants doing necessary work. The German casualties brought in were mostly young men, teenagers some of them, conscripts who'd been thrown into defensive fighting. They couldn't win against Allied forces that outnumbered and outgunned them. Fraser treated shrapnel wounds and gunshot wounds and burns from tank fires, the same injuries she'd been treating for months, but now on boys who spoke German and prayed to the same God in a different language. One of the German wounded was the young Unteroffizier who'd first burst through the door pointing his rifle at Fraser. He'd been hit by shell fragments during the Canadian counterattack, metal shards embedded in his shoulder and upper chest, bleeding badly enough to be life-threatening. Fraser had operated on him with one of the Canadian doctors assisting, removing the fragments, cleaning the wounds, closing the incisions with careful stitches. The boy had been semi-conscious through most of it, delirious from morphine and blood loss, calling for his mother in German that Fraser didn't understand but recognized for what it was. She'd held his hand afterward, sitting beside his bed while he came out of the anesthesia, the same thing she'd done for dozens of Canadian soldiers, because wounded young men needed comfort regardless of what flag they served. The German officer who'd examined Fraser's log came to check on the underofficer and found Fraser sitting there holding the boy's hand. He'd stood quietly watching for a moment, then spoken to Fraser in a voice that carried something like sadness. "This is his first combat," the officer had said. "He volunteered because he believed what they told him about glory and duty. Now he learns the real cost." Fraser had looked up at the officer. "He'll live," she'd said. "The wounds aren't as bad as they looked initially. He'll recover and probably return to duty." The officer had nodded. "Because of you," he'd said. "Because you saved him, even though he is your enemy, and you are his prisoner." Fraser had been too tired for philosophical discussions about enemies and humanity. But the officer's words had stuck with her, would stay with her for the rest of her life, a recognition that war created these impossible situations where you found yourself providing life-saving care to people who'd been trying to kill your countrymen hours earlier. The moral complexity was overwhelming if you thought about it too hard, so Fraser had learned not to think about it. She focused on the medical task in front of her, the wound that needed cleaning, the artery that needed clamping, the IV that needed checking. Those were concrete problems with concrete solutions. Whether saving this particular German soldier was right or wrong, whether he'd go on to kill Allied troops or go home and never fight again, those weren't questions a nurse in a field hospital could afford to contemplate. On the third day of German occupation, Canadian forces retook the area in a brief but intense firefight that left several more wounded men needing Fraser's care. The German troops had withdrawn in good order, taking their mobile wounded with them, but leaving the serious casualties who couldn't be moved. The Canadian forces had arrived expecting to find their medical staff prisoners, possibly maltreated or worse. Instead, they'd found Fraser and the other nurses still working, still treating wounded, having continued operations through the entire German occupation without missing a shift. The Canadian officers had been surprised and impressed, had asked detailed questions about how they'd been treated and whether the Germans had interfered with medical operations. Fraser had reported truthfully that the Germans had been correct and professional, that they'd allowed continued treatment of all wounded, that they'd even brought their own casualties for care. This had surprised the Canadian officers, who'd been raised on the same propaganda as everyone else about German brutality and disregard for human life. But Fraser could only report what she'd experienced, and what she'd experienced was German soldiers who'd respected medical neutrality and a German officer who'd protected a captured enemy hospital, because that was what military law and basic decency required. The Canadian counterattack commander had been particularly interested in Fraser's log, the detailed record that showed over 700 patients treated in 4 months. He'd asked permission to review it and had spent an hour reading through the entries, checking names against casualty lists, verifying numbers that seemed almost impossible for such a small medical staff. When he'd finished, he'd looked at Fraser with an expression that combined respect and something like awe. "Lieutenant Fraser," he'd said, "do you understand what you've accomplished here? You've treated more casualties than some battalion aid stations see in a year. You've saved lives that would have been lost without immediate care. The work you and your staff have done is extraordinary." Fraser had accepted the praise with the same tired calm she'd shown when German rifles had been pointed at her. "We did our job, sir," she'd said. "That's all. There were wounded men who needed help and we helped them." The commander had wanted to say more, had wanted to emphasize the significance of what Fraser had accomplished, but he'd seen the exhaustion in her face and had simply thanked her and let her return to work. The war had moved on, as war always does. Canadian forces had continued pushing north through Italy, fighting from town to town, suffering casualties that Fraser and nurses like her would treat in field hospitals that moved forward to stay close to the fighting. Fraser had worked through the Italian campaign, through the invasion of France, through the final push into Germany, always close to the front lines, always treating whoever needed help, accumulating a patient count that would eventually exceed 3,000 by the time Germany surrendered in May 1945. She'd never spoken much about the German capture of her hospital or about the German officer who'd read her log and understood what she'd been doing. It seemed like a footnote, a brief interlude in years of continuous work that blurred together into an endless stream of wounded men and blood-soaked bandages and decisions made in seconds that determined whether someone lived or died. But decades later, when military historians were researching Canadian medical operations in World War II, they'd find Fraser's log in the archives and would recognize it as one of the most detailed records of frontline medical care that had survived from the war. The log would be studied in medical schools and military hospitals, analyzed for its documentation of treatment protocols and survival rates under combat conditions. Researchers would calculate that Fraser had worked an average of 93 hours per week during her 4 months at the Ortona Hospital, that she'd maintained a patient survival rate higher than comparable facilities despite operating under more difficult conditions, that her treatment of both Allied and Axis wounded had set a standard for medical neutrality that influenced post-war Geneva Convention updates. But these academic analyses would miss what Fraser herself had known intuitively, that the real significance of her work was simpler and more profound. She'd kept young men alive who would otherwise have died. She'd given them chances to survive their wounds, to recover, to go home to families who were waiting for them. The number 743 wasn't just a statistic. It was 743 individual human beings whose lives had hung in the balance and who'd tipped toward life rather than death because Fraser had been there with the right skills, at the right moment. The German officer who'd captured the hospital and read Fraser's log had survived the war. He'd returned to Germany in 1945, had rebuilt his life in the shattered remains of his country, and had become a doctor in civilian practice, treating patients in a small town in Bavaria. He'd kept notes from his wartime service, including a copy of the page from Fraser's log that documented treatment of German prisoners. In the 1960s, he'd written a letter to Canadian military archives, asking if they had any information about Lieutenant Margaret Fraser, because he wanted to express gratitude for the care she'd provided to German wounded at a time when she had every reason to hate Germans and every justification for providing minimal care. The archives had forwarded the letter to Fraser, who by then was retired and living back in Nova Scotia, working part-time at the same small-town clinic where her mother had once been the unofficial nurse. She'd read the German officer's letter with mixed emotions, surprised that he remembered after so many years, touched that he felt gratitude for what she'd done, but also uncomfortable with being praised for simply doing her job. She'd written a brief reply, thanking him for his kind words, but emphasizing that she'd only done what any nurse should do, that treating wounded regardless of nationality wasn't heroic, it was basic professional and moral obligation. The correspondence had continued sporadically over the years, two former enemies connected by a brief encounter in an Italian monastery during a war that had shaped both their lives. The German doctor had told Fraser about former patients he'd encountered, men who'd been treated at the field hospital and who'd survived to build families and careers, who existed because Fraser had been skilled and dedicated and hadn't allowed nationality to determine who deserved medical care. Fraser had appreciated these updates, but had never quite known how to process them. She'd saved those German soldiers not because she was especially compassionate or morally advanced, but because they'd been wounded men needing help, and she'd been a nurse whose entire purpose was providing that help. The fact that the help had been remembered and appreciated decades later was gratifying, but also irrelevant to the original decision, which had been based simply on need and professional duty. Fraser had died in 1993 at age 75, her obituary mentioning her wartime service, but not capturing the full scope of what she'd accomplished or the lives she'd saved. The local newspaper had interviewed her shortly before her death, asking about her war experiences, and she'd given characteristically modest answers. "I was a nurse," she'd said. "I treated wounded soldiers. That was my job." When pressed for dramatic stories or heroic moments, she'd resisted. "There's nothing heroic about changing bandages or administering morphine," she'd said. "It's just work that needs doing. The real heroes were the soldiers in combat. We just tried to patch them up afterward." But the soldiers Fraser had treated would have told a different story. They would have described a calm presence in chaos, skilled hands that worked efficiently even under shellfire, a steady voice that reassured terrified young men that they were going to be okay, even when they weren't sure that was true. They would have talked about a nurse who treated German prisoners with the same care she gave to Canadian soldiers, who never let exhaustion or fear interfere with her medical judgment, who kept working through circumstances that would have broken weaker people. These weren't the kinds of stories that made headlines or earned medals, but they were the stories that defined who Fraser really was and what she'd contributed to the war effort. The 743 patients Fraser treated during those 4 months in Italy were just a fraction of her total wartime count, but they represented a microcosm of her entire service. Each number in that log was a person, a life, a story. Some of those stories ended in recovery and homecoming. Some ended in death despite Fraser's best efforts. But every one of them involved a moment where Fraser had stood between a wounded soldier and death, had used her training and skill to tip the balance toward survival, had provided care when care was desperately needed. That was her war. Not dramatic battles or strategic decisions, but an endless succession of medical crises handled with competence and compassion regardless of circumstances. The German officer's surprise at discovering the scope of Fraser's work, his recognition that this captured Canadian nurse had saved hundreds of lives, including German lives, that moment of acknowledgement mattered not because it validated Fraser's choices, but because it illustrated a truth that war often obscures. Medical personnel operate in a different, moral space than combat soldiers. They're trained to heal rather than harm, to save rather than kill. When forced into combat zones, they bring with them ethical commitments that transcend the conflict around them. Fraser's treatment of German prisoners wasn't unusual or extraordinary from a medical perspective. It was simply what the profession required. But in the context of war, where hatred and dehumanization of enemies was encouraged and expected, maintaining that professional neutrality represented a form of moral courage that deserves recognition. The story of Margaret Fraser and the 743 patients she treated in 4 months of Italian combat isn't about heroism in the traditional sense. It's about dedication to a profession that serves humanity regardless of politics or nationality. It's about a young woman from rural Nova Scotia who found herself in hell and responded by doing everything in her power to alleviate suffering wherever she found it. It's about the unglamorous, exhausting, essential work that medical personnel perform in every war, work that saves lives without firing a shot, work that deserves to be remembered and honored, even though it rarely generates the dramatic narratives that dominate military history. Fraser treated over 700 patients in 4 months, because that's what needed doing, and she was there to do it. That's the whole story, and maybe that's enough.